New York City, 8.8 million people, Times Square lit up with 1,000 billboards, a $2 trillion economy anchored by Wall Street. Now drive 3 hours north into Vermont. 643,000 people in the entire state. Not a single billboard on any highway. No city above 45,000. 99% small businesses. These two states share a border. But this is not a story about geography or accident. Vermont was literally founded as a rebellion against New York, and every major decision it has made in 250 years has been a deliberate choice to become New York's opposite. The question is whether that choice can survive what is happening right now. To understand how Vermont became the anti-New York, you have to go back to a property dispute that turned into an identity. In the 1760s, settlers living in what they called the New Hampshire Grants had cleared wilderness, built cabins, and planted crops on land they believed was legally theirs. Then Albany announced that New York claimed every acre of it. New York's colonial government wanted to void those titles, impose its own, and collect taxes from people who had carved farms out of forest with their own hands. These were not abstract legal maneuvers. Families who had spent years breaking ground and raising barns were told that speculators in downstate New York now owned the land beneath their feet. The response was not polite. Armed resistance formed almost immediately. Settlers organized under leaders like Thomas Chittenden, who saw New York not as a neighbor, but as a distant, self-interested power extracting wealth from people who had done the actual work. Farmers grabbed muskets. Surveyors sent by Albany were chased off at gunpoint. Land agents who tried to enforce New York titles found their papers burned and their authority openly mocked. This was not philosophy. It was survival. The people living in those Green Mountain valleys were watching their entire futures get signed away to Manhattan speculators who had never swung an axe or pulled a stump. That fight forged something deeper than a border dispute. It created a founding wound, an identity built on resisting a larger, richer, more powerful neighbor to the west. The anti-New York instinct was not born from culture or temperament. It was born from watching distant elites try to take what locals had built. In that pattern, small against large, local against metropolitan, self-determination against outside control would repeat for the next 250 years. The resistance did not stop at chasing off surveyors. In January 1777, while the rest of the colonies were still fighting Britain, delegates meeting at Westminster did something almost unthinkable. They declared independence not just from the British Crown, but from New York. Vermont wrote its own constitution, and what they put in it was extraordinary. The 1777 text banned adult slavery outright, specifying that no male over 21 or female over 18 could be held as a servant or slave. It was the first such provision in North American history. On top of that, Vermont granted universal male suffrage with no property requirement. You did not need to own land to have a voice. Meanwhile, New York's economy remained deeply entangled with slavery through shipping, finance, and the insurance contracts that underwrote the trade. Two states emerging side by side, one abolishing human bondage, the other profiting from it. But Congress refused to recognize Vermont. New York blocked its admission to the Union at every turn, unwilling to surrender the territorial claim. So Vermont did something no other American territory has ever done. It operated as a fully independent republic for 14 years. It minted its own coins, ran its own postal routes, negotiated with foreign governments, and conducted its affairs as a sovereign nation surrounded on all sides by the United States. When Congress still would not budge, some Vermont leaders quietly explored rejoining the British Empire through Canada. They would rather be British again than be absorbed by New York. That single fact tells you everything about how deep the opposition ran. And if Vermont resisted New York this hard at birth, the question becomes what happened over the next 2 centuries. If you want to understand how places like this defy the patterns you'd expect, subscribe. Vermont finally joined the Union in 1791 as the 14th state, but almost immediately the two neighbors began pulling in opposite directions. New York urbanized at staggering speed. New York City became the dominant Atlantic port, then the undisputed financial capital of the world. Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange, Tammany Hall, wave after wave of immigration, vertical growth that turned Manhattan into a canyon of stone and glass. The city did not just grow, it consumed. It pulled in talent, capital, and ambition from the entire continent and beyond. Vermont did the opposite. Farms emptied as sons and daughters left for cheaper Western land or the factory wages of growing cities. The population flattened. Towns that had bustled during the early republic settled into a quiet rhythm of dairy herds and church steeples. Hill farms that had once supported families were abandoned one by one, their stone walls slowly disappearing under second-growth forest. By the early 20th century, the contrast was locked in. New York had built a metro area of over 18 million people crammed into 3,450 square miles, generating roughly $2 trillion in GDP, one of the largest economic concentrations on Earth. Vermont had 648,000 people spread across an entire state, with no city above roughly 45,000. 88% of New Yorkers live in urban areas. Vermont barely registers on the urbanization scale at all. On paper, this looks like Vermont lost. Depopulation, shrinking farms, a state left behind by the engine of American growth. But what happened next reveals that the emptiness was about to become something deliberate. A choice, not a defeat. In the mid-20th century, highways and billboards were spreading across America like a rash. National advertisers plastered roadside signs along every scenic route they could reach, turning corridors through farmland and forest into tunnels of commercial noise. Most states shrugged and took the ad revenue. Vermont pushed back. Citizen committees organized against outdoor advertising with an intensity that caught the industry off guard. A Vermont critic named Vrest Orton warned that advertisers had an urge to plaster all the roads retaining the least vestige of adjacent beauty, calling it basically un-Vermonterish. His rallying cry became a motto. Behind the signboard lies Vermont. In 1968, the state became the first in America to ban virtually all roadside billboards, one of only 4 states ever to do it. Maine, Alaska, and Hawaii followed later, but Vermont went first. The result is something you feel before you understand it. Drive Interstate 89 through Vermont today and the view is unbroken. Forests, fields, mountains. The curve of the Green Mountains against the sky and nothing else. No neon, no logos, no competing claims on your attention. Now drive Interstate 95 through the New York metro area. A wall of billboards stacked 3 deep, fast food signs, insurance ads, and LED screens flashing at highway speed. Same country, same era, opposite visual universes. One state decided that what you see from the road matters. The other let the market decide. Vermont chose the view, but the billboard ban was just the opening move. 2 years later, Vermont went much further. Interstate highways had opened Vermont to developers in ways the old 2-lane roads never could. Ski resorts were expanding, second home subdivisions crept into valleys, strip malls and motel clusters began appearing at interchange after interchange, the same generic commercial sprawl that had already swallowed the corridors around New York's metro highways. Vermont saw what was coming and decided to stop it. In 1970, the state passed Act 250, one of the most aggressive land use laws in American history. Any development over 10 acres required a permit. Any project above 2,500 feet in elevation required a permit. Any housing development over 10 units required a permit. In towns without their own zoning, the threshold dropped to just 1 acre. Regional environmental commissions reviewed every major proposal against criteria that went far beyond building codes. They evaluated aesthetic impact, environmental consequences, and effects on the surrounding community. This was deliberate underdevelopment, a law designed to keep Vermont from becoming the thing it had spent 2 centuries rejecting. And it worked. The ridgeline stayed clean. Village centers kept their white clapboard churches and town greens. Farm landscapes survived where they would have been bulldozed in almost any other eastern state. Drive through central Vermont today and you can still see a landscape that looks remarkably like it did a century ago, not by accident, but by law. But this is where the story gets complicated. Act 250 preserved the beauty. It also constrained housing supply, raised development costs, and made it harder for working-class Vermonters to find affordable homes in the places where they work. Permit processes added time and expense that large developers could absorb, but small builders could not. The same law that kept the strip malls out also kept the apartment buildings from going up. Vermont chose beauty over growth, and that choice carried a price that would compound for decades. The same logic that rejected billboards and big development also reshaped how Vermont governs. Every March, Vermonters gather in one-room town halls, sometimes fewer than 100 voters in the building, to debate budgets, road repairs, and local policy over coffee and donuts. A moderator opens with, "Good morning, everyone, and welcome to democracy." This is not a quaint tradition preserved for tourists. It is how decisions actually get made. In towns like Elmore, residents file in while ice fishing shacks still dot the frozen lake outside and steam rises from sugar houses boiling maple sap on the surrounding hills. This scale of governance created something unusual in American politics, a state where a viable third party could actually take root. Vermont's Progressive Party, led most famously by Bernie Sanders, built careers on opposing corporate power and Wall Street influence in a state where districts are small enough that a candidate can knock on nearly every voter's door. Sanders won the Burlington mayor's race by 10 votes. In Vermont, 10 votes is not a rounding error. It is a mandate. Compare that to New York, where Tammany Hall invented machine politics, where a single congressional race can cost tens of millions of dollars, and where media market campaigns are fought on television screens, not in living rooms. Same political system, same constitution, opposite operating scales. Vermont kept governance small enough that individuals still matter. New York scaled governance until only institutions could compete. This opposition shows up in the numbers more starkly than almost anywhere else in America. New York City's metro area generates roughly $2 trillion in GDP, one of the largest metro economies on the planet, anchored by Wall Street, the NYSE, and NASDAQ. Entire nations produce less economic output than a single borough of Manhattan. Vermont's economy runs on dairy farms, maple syrup, tourism, small-scale manufacturing, and craft businesses. 99% of Vermont businesses are small businesses. Roughly 60% of the state's employment comes from them. There are no Fortune 500 headquarters in Vermont, no gleaming corporate campuses, no trading floors where billions change hands before lunch. But here is what is counterintuitive. This is not failure. Vermont chose this. The billboard ban, Act 250, the town meeting structure, the resistance to corporate consolidation, all of it was designed to prevent the kind of economic concentration that defines New York. Vermont does not have Fortune 500 headquarters because it built a system that makes Fortune 500 operations difficult. The regulations, the permit processes, the community review boards, the sheer smallness of the market, all of it functions as a filter. What passes through that filter is local, independent, and small scale. What gets blocked is exactly what dominates New York. The emptiness is the product. Here is where the 250-year story flips on itself. Vermont's population barely grew, from roughly 643,000 to about 648,000 over 4 years. Young people kept leaving for cities with more jobs and more opportunity. The tax base shrank. Schools consolidated. The state that had chosen smallness was aging into it whether it wanted to or not. Then the pandemic hit, and remote work sent a wave of new residents pouring into Vermont, many of them from the New York metro area. They came for the scenery, the quiet, the clean ridgelines and uncluttered highways and village greens that Vermont's laws had spent half a century protecting. They came because Vermont looked like everything New York was not. And they brought New York's money with them. Housing prices spiked. In some counties, median home prices jumped over 30% in barely 2 years. Vacation homes sit empty most of the year in towns where workers cannot find a place to rent at any price. Short-term rentals converted apartments that teachers and plumbers and restaurant servers used to live in into weekend getaways listed at $300 a night. The people who make Vermont actually function, the ones who plow the roads in January, pour the coffee in ski-town diners, and teach in the elementary schools, got priced out by the same metropolitan wealth Vermont was designed to resist. In some mountain towns, essential workers now commute an hour each way because they cannot afford to live where they work. The pattern is almost cruelly precise. Vermont spent 250 years building an identity in opposition to New York. That identity created a place so appealing that New Yorkers came to claim it. The anti-New York state is being reshaped by New Yorkers. The very quality of life that attracted them is threatened by their arrival. Vermont is not being conquered. It is being admired to death. In 1777, Vermont looked at New York and said no. No to its land claims, no to its slave economy, no to its vision of what a state should be. Every generation since has repeated that refusal. No to billboards, no to sprawl, no to corporate consolidation, no to machine politics. Vermont's entire identity is a 250-year-old act of defiance, a state built not on what it wanted to become, but on what it refused to be. But the question that hangs over all of it is whether a state built on saying no can survive when the thing it rejected shows up at the door. Not as an invader, but as a neighbor who loves what you have built and wants to stay. Two states share a border. One became the largest, loudest, most concentrated expression of American ambition. The other became its mirror image, deliberately small, deliberately quiet, deliberately empty. And now, for the first time, the mirror is starting to crack. Check out the videos on screen for more, and subscribe if you haven't already.